Most beloved Heavenly Father, Heavenly Parent, we thank you so much we're able to meet again this evening. Thank you so much that so many people have been able to come along and attend our lectures and discussions again this evening. We thank you for many blessings and the incredible grace that we receive from you to live in such a wonderful world, have such a wonderful families and friends, and to be able to have the grace of living at the time of our true parents, and to be able to live in a space where we're free to be able to study and to read and speak and do so many things which so many people through the whole of human history have longed to be able to do. We really want to appreciate and be grateful for this incredible blessing, a result of your providence and the people that responded to your providence to create this realm for freedom, where our true parents could be born and could carry out their mission. We pray, Heavenly Father, to unite with them and to complete things, to expand your sovereignty now in this world, but also in the next world as well. Well, we know our Father is working so diligently. We pray you'll guide us this evening and ask your blessing upon all the things that we study. And ask this in my name, William Haynes, of Central Blessed Family. Arju. Okay, so I'm going to carry on from where I left off on Thursday. And so we looked on Thursday, tracing God's providence for the Lord of the Second Advent to be born and how things developed in Korea. And we saw the incredible persecution that Christians went through in Korea, Catholic Church in particular. That led, as I said, the last lecture to about, I can't remember now, about 10,000 Korean Catholics being martyred in 1866 or so, I think it was. Anyway, look and see how Protestantism came to Korea. So there was this person, Robert Jermaine Thomas. He came from Wales, and he went as a missionary, first of all, to China, and he learned to speak Chinese fluently within a very short time, and he's delivering sermons and doing witnessing and evangelical work in China very, very quickly. And then he heard that there were Christians in Korea who didn't have Bibles. And so he decided to take Chinese Bibles to Korea, because at that time there were no Korean Bibles, Korean translations of the Bible. So in August 1866, so this was during the time of intense persecution of Korean Catholics, he found that there was a trading ship, the General Sherman, that was traveling to Korea. And so this ship, it traveled up, it tried to get, so during this time, there were many different countries that were trying to establish trading relationships with Korea. And Korea was very xenophobic, and the Korean court and king said they didn't want to have any trading relationship with any other countries. And so they kept on being rebuffed and pushed away. Anyway, the General Sherman went up the river, the one that Seoul is on, I can't remember what it's called now, and then tried to get landing rights, but they were told to go away. But they carried on, and then some of them landed. There was some conflict and some misunderstanding, and there was a clash between the people on the General Sherman, which was a trading ship, and the Korean local militia, you might say. And then the General Sherman ran aground, and then it was attacked by Koreans, and they set fire to it. And then Thomas, who was on the boat, he grabbed as many Bibles as he could, and he jumped into the water, and he waded through the river onto the land, and he started handing out Bibles to all the people who were there, the Koreans that were there. And then he was beheaded, executed on the spot. And then he handed his last Bible to the man who beheaded him, and he was martyred. And then, interestingly enough, it was against the law to accept Bibles in Korea at that time. He would have been put to death anyway, because he took Chinese Bibles to Korea. Oh, that's right. Sorry. Before he went on the General Sherman, he was traveling around incognito, disguised in Korea, pretending to be a Korean, distributing Bibles in Korea. Yeah, the risk of his life. He was going around traveling on distributing Bibles. Then he went back to China. Then he found got a lift on the General Sherman to go to Korea, and his martyrs. As I said, having Bibles was against the law in Korea. Anyway, Bibles are made of paper, and paper is really expensive and valuable. And so what lots of the people who received these, what a lot of the Koreans who received these Bibles did, instead of burning the Bibles or throwing the Bibles away, which is what they were supposed to do, they took the Bibles home with them, and they ripped out all the pages, and they used the paper to wallpaper their rooms. And so the rooms then in their homes inside were wallpapered with Chinese Bibles. Anyway, so when the winter came and they were sitting around in their homes, you know, keeping warm and getting a bit bored, they started reading the walls. And when they read the walls, they had this encounter with the Word of God. They experienced God's Word through the Bible, through the pages of the Bible that were stuck to the walls. They found God speaking to them through that, and many of them then they came to believe in God and had a rebirth experience with Jesus through the Holy Spirit. So they started to feel the Holy Spirit speaking to them through the Bible, which they'd used to wallpaper their homes. And so this is a remarkable thing. So Protestant Christianity started in Korea not through missionaries, but directly through the Word of God, through the Bible, speaking to people's heart and their soul. And people started then to gather together to read the walls and form these study groups, reading the Bible, which is pasted onto their wallpaper. So that was how Protestant Christianity came to Korea. And then in 1877, there was a Scotsman who became a missionary. He came from a tiny little village on the, I think it was the east coast of Scotland, as far as I remember, and sort of north of the Black Isle, for those of you who know Scotland. And he got a calling to become a missionary. And so he went as a missionary from Scotland, and he went to China, and then he learned Chinese, then he learned Korean, and then he translated the Bible into Korean. And then he traveled around Korea distributing, not the whole Bible, but distributing parts of the Bible that he translated into Korean. So it's interesting, from Wales and then from Scotland, his missionaries came. And then the next person who took over translating the Bible into Korean was an Anglican, Church of England bishop called Bishop Crosswaite. And if anybody knows Ashley Crosswaite, he was a relative of Ashley Crosswaite, who's a church member in England. And he then continued and set up some kind of institute to complete the translation of the Bible into Korean. So it's interesting there, as I mentioned on Thursday, how Britain then as the Eve nation, or the mother nation, had a responsibility to give birth to the first, second, and third Israels. So it gave birth to the first Israel, re-establishment of the Jewish homeland, Israel becoming an independent nation again in 1948. It also gave birth to second Israel, which is, of course, the United States of America, and also gave birth to the third Israel, which is Korea, in that way, which I found that's kind of interesting. And so that's how Protestant Christianity started to spread in Korea. Anyway, I also mentioned on Thursday how things hadn't have gone right in Korea. That's the most that Britain was able to do towards fulfilling its responsibilities as a mother nation to Korea. As I explained, had things gone differently in 1866, when there was an opportunity for the Korea to form an alliance, a protectorate with Britain and France, then Korea then could become a British protectorate in the part of the British Empire, and it could receive from Britain, it could have inherited from Britain the whole Judeo-Christian liberal democratic tradition of education, of industrialization, politics, government, of law, of justice, and it could have received that from Britain. I explained, unfortunately, it didn't do that. It rebuffed Britain, and it didn't want to have any kind of relationship with Britain or with America, that also is trying to make a relationship with Korea. It refused to make any kind of relationship. Anyway, so in 1854 then, as many of you know, the United States signed a treaty with Japan. This Commodore, can't remember his name now, went into Japan with some gunboats and made a treaty with Japan. And then through this, then Japan was able to inherit Western technology, was able to modernize. And that led to the Meiji Restoration, 1868, and a huge industrial and anyway, modernization of Japan. I don't know a lot about it, but I just know it modernized. And then Korea made an unequal trade relationship with trade treaty with Japan. So different countries had their eyes on Korea. Up until this time, Korea had been under Japanese. It made tribute to Japan. You know, the Chinese emperor was like the overlord of the Korean king. The Chinese emperor was the emperor, and Korea was a kingdom, and so Korea then made tribute, sent tribute to China because it's under Chinese hegemony in that sense. At the same time, as I said, Russia was moving east. It had a seaport in Port Arthur. It also wanted to move further east, and it was interested in Korea. And so there are lots of Russian diplomats in Korea, along with Chinese diplomats in Korea and Japanese diplomats in Korea. China, Japan, and Korea, China, Russia, and Japan were all trying to have, rule and some kind of, and dominate Korea in some way. And so when you're in that kind of situation, you have to realize, well, in an era of empires, you have to choose. Are you going to be part of the China? Are you going to be dominated by Japan? Or you're going to continue to be dominated by China? Or are you going to allow yourself to be dominated by Russia? Or are you going to allow yourself to be dominated by Japan? Or are you going to try and find some other protector? It's like, in the era of protection rackets, you have to choose, well, which organized criminal gang am I going to invite to sign up to as a protection racket? And Korea didn't want to be dominated by anybody, and that was a strategic error, I would say. As I said, if they'd gone along with the British, they would have received a huge benefit and blessing from that. Anyway, so Japan then was very interested in Korea because Japan felt Korea is like a launching pad to Japan. Either from Japan, either from China or from Russia. As Russia's moving towards Korea, Japan then was very concerned. So Japan then wanted to dominate, occupy, and have some kind of domination over Korea, also because it wanted to expand into Manchuria for living space and also for raw materials. So anyway, in 1876, Korea rebuffed all these countries, but then Japan forced Korea to make an unequal trade treaty with it. Very much in the same way that America did with Japan. And then in 1882, again, Korea approached Japan. America approached Korea. Do you want some kind of trade treaty? And so the Korean king, he wanted American goods and technology and protection, but he did not want Christianity or democracy. So it was like he wanted that, but he didn't want any Christianity or missionaries or democracy or any kind of Americans settling there or anything. So it wasn't such an interesting agreement for the Americans. But anyway, America promised to protect Korea, but you can imagine Americans weren't all that enthusiastic about it because there's nothing in it for America. And then, as I said, generally speaking, Korean court politics rejected closer relationships with the West. But then, as I said, Japan made this treaty, unequal trade treaty. And through this trade treaty, it separated Korea from its relationship with China. So from this point on, then Korea became independent from China. And then there was a first Chinese-Japanese war, 1894 to 5. So this was Japan wanting to move into Manchuria. So through this, then Korea became nominally independent. It's called the Empire of Korea. Empire means that you're not under anybody else's rule or authority. And then after that, there was Anglo-Japanese alliance. So this is also very significant. So, as I said, Korea, I mean, there was a possibility of Britain making some kind of agreement with Korea. But anyway, Britain was particularly, at this time, wanting to stop Russia expanding. So Russia and Britain were in conflict down in Afghanistan, over India, because Russia wanted to move south to have a warm seaport somewhere. So there's conflict there and then there's earlier conflict between Britain and Russia in the Crimean War. And so it was like this sort of rivalry. And so Japan also regarded Russia as a threat. And so, because both Britain and Japan regarded Russia as a threat, then Britain and Japan made an alliance. And so part of this also created space for Japan to be able to advance its desire to dominate Korea further. And then there was a Russia-Japanese war, which I think I mentioned, and which led to Japan sinking the Russian Navy. This also led to a huge uprising in Russia, closing the Duma, and and then after that, there was a Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed between Russia, Japan, and the United States. And so there's a bit of a deal going on here. And so it was agreed that Japan could have a free hand in Korea. America agreed to give Japan a free hand in Korea if Japan agreed to give America a free hand in the Philippines. And so that's what happened then. So America came to dominate the Philippines, and in exchange, Japan came to have much more say over what was going on in Korea. Where this extra noise is coming from. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. Okay. Then there was another second, and then after that, there was a Yulsa Treaty, 1905. So again, this was an unequal force treaty. Korea became a protectorate of Japan. And then there was a Japan-Korea Treaty, where Korea was controlled by Japan. And then finally, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty, where there's a complete loss of Korean sovereignty. And Korea basically became part of Japan from an administrative, political point of view. And the Japanese claimed that Korea and Japan are a unified nation. And that's what happened there. And so during this occupation, as I said, Japan wanted to expand into Manchuria. The only way to get to Manchuria easily is through Korea. They wanted space, living space to settle raw materials, and also to stop Korea being used to attack Japan. 100,000 Japanese families went and settled in Korea, and they took a lot of farming land, a lot of land, which is Korean land, and they took that land. Also, lots of cultural symbols in Korea were destroyed, such as a palace and lots of historical artifacts and things. The forced worship of Japanese gods, like Shinto shrines, because they tried to make people a single unified people. So Koreans were encouraged and pressurized to adopt Japanese names, and basically try to eradicate Korean culture. Anyway, so that was what was going on there. So as I said, that I would say was a mistake. The Japanese occupation of Korea should never have happened. The result of it has been intense resentment and hatred by Koreans towards Japanese people up until today. And if you read the sort of language coming out of South Korea and also out of North Korea, especially towards Japan, it's incredibly aggressive, incredibly resentful, and incredibly dreadful, to be honest. A real threat to peace, not just in East Asia. So I don't think that should have happened. Instead, anyway, so as I said, Korean Christianity started to grow. Protestantism started to grow gradually. Then missionaries went there from America, from Britain. And then there was a sort of revival in Wonsan in 1903, the beginnings of a prayer revival, the Holy Spirit. And then there was a huge revival in Wales in 1904 to 1905, when hundreds of thousands of Welsh people, out of a relatively small population, had this incredible rebirth experience of the Holy Spirit. As I said, there was continually one revival in Wales after another of the Holy Spirit. This is the last major revival. There was another one around about the end of the Second World War, as far as I remember, also affected Scotland, the Highlands of Scotland. It was an incredibly powerful revival of Christianity and revival, the temperance movement, all sorts of things in Wales. This revival then, and news of this revival spread to India, and from India, it then spread to Korea in 1907. And so I found it was interesting that there's a place in Wales, which Korean little village in the south of Wales, I can't remember what it's called now, on the coast near Swansea. I should have looked it up, I'm sorry, where Korean Christians trace the beginnings of this Korean Pentecost, this little church. And there's statues there, and there's plaques, and Koreans sometimes go there on a sort of pilgrimage. And then it spread to Korea, and there's a meeting of missionaries and there's a lot of prayer meeting, and they started to confess their sins. They started to get convicted by the Holy Spirit. And then there's this incredible outpouring of prayer and repentance and confession and rebirth, which spread very, very rapidly through Korea. And today, whereas in Wales, a larger number of people were converted in Wales during this period, but then it fizzled out in time. Whereas Korean Christianity today is probably the most vital in the world, sends out nowadays the most missionaries, except perhaps for America, and also has some of the largest congregations in the world. So that was what was going on there. But Korea itself then was occupied by Japan, and the Koreans weren't happy with the way with being occupied, and also they weren't happy with the way the occupation was developing. And so in 1919, Christians and Democrats heard about the Wilson Declaration, and so they thought, we would like independence as well. So part of Woodrow Wilson's declaration of the basis of peace at the end of the First World War was that all empires should release their colonies. And so the Koreans thought, that's a great idea. We've been colonized by Japan. We want to become independent. And so a little group of them declared Korean independence. And if you've read True Mother's autobiography, you'll have read all about this. And they sent a delegation to Versailles. And Japan was one of the delegations in the conference in Japan. In the conference in Versailles was Japan. And you might wonder, what were the Japanese doing there? Well, part of the treaty that Britain and Japan made in 1904, I think it was, again, meant that Japan entered the First World War on the side of Britain and America. Actually, America wasn't happy that Britain made this alliance with Japan because, it was awkward for America. It was also awkward for Britain because, if Britain had to choose between Japan and America, where there's rising tension, then Britain would probably choose America. It was also awkward for Canada and for Australia and New Zealand. They weren't happy with this conflict of interest that Britain made this treaty with Japan. But as I said, Britain made it because it wanted to, it was against Russia, basically. Anyway, so that's why Japan was there in Versailles. So the nations that had to release and give up their colonies were the nations that lost. So Germany, Austria, Hungarian Empire was broken up, the Ottoman Empire was broken up, and these empires were broken up. But the British Empire remained, the French Empire remained, and the Japanese Empire remained as well. So the Korean delegation then, the Japanese refused to allow the Korean delegation into the conference of Versailles to present their case. But anyway, there was a sense, as father talked about, mother talked about, where Korea actually connected to the Worldwide Foundation for the Messiah. Koreans, finally wanted to have a little bit of liberal democracy, you might say. Finally connected Worldwide Foundation for the Messiah. So 2 million Koreans participated in 1,500 demonstrations. About 7,500 were killed, 16,000 wounded. There's, trying to get independent from Japan, 46,000 arrested. So the Korean delegation, though, at Versailles was blocked by Japan and the United States. And then shortly after this, then Father was born. So in that sense, that's why there was this, anyways, it says in the principle, the First World War, the successful outcome of the First World War established the foundation substance that Cain and Abel overcoming Cain, a successful foundation substance for the birth of the Messiah. Okay, so towards the end on Thursday, somebody asked me, I just happened to say as a throwaway comment that Koreans and Jews have the same family structure. And then this led to a conversation discussion. Anyway, so I sort of trying to quote from some book which I'd read about 35 years ago, what I could remember. Anyway, so I went back and looked it up, a bit more detail. This is a book. I would say this is one of the most important, if you're interested in anything, to be honest, this is one of the most important books to read. It's out of print. You can't buy it, but it's written by someone called Emmanuel Todd. He is a professor of anthropology, French professor of anthropology, and he did his PhD in Oxford. But he's a very influential French intellectual, except that he should be much better known than he is. So he took this, we have this idea in the principle that the family is the basis of society, and then we move on to the next topic. He actually studied the anthropology of the family and took this idea seriously that the family is the basis of society. And so he said the family structure and social systems, and he said the best way to understand ideology, in other words, the values of a nation or a people, to understand the family structure. So he said something like this: the peoples of the world are different in their ideological orientations because they have different family structures. And that's his fundamental point. You might wonder, why are French, German, Japanese, English, Russians, Chinese, why are these people, why are we different? He said the reason why we're different, we have different values and different ideology and different political, economic, and social culture, and therefore different political, social, and economic institutions, is because we have different family structures. Yeah. So he said the world's different ideologies and ideological tendencies, such as communism, Islam, social democracy, Anglo-Saxon liberalism, the Indian caste system, and so on, are all projections onto the public stage of the ideas first learned within the family. So within the family, from our parents, we learn values, from the way that our parents interact with each other, from the relationship we have with our parents, from the relationship we have with our uncles, aunts, and cousins, from all these relationships. All these relationships embody certain kind of values about what is, about certain kind of values, about certain kind of customs and traditions and values. And it's from there that we get our sense of what is right and wrong, how we should live, etc., etc. And anybody who got married and blessed to someone from a different nationality, especially different culture, they realize it's like marrying someone from a completely different world, with fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of reality, about the nature of marriage, about the nature of parenthood, about how you should relate to things, and this, that, and the other. Very, very different. So anyway, as an anthropologist studying the family, he studied all the data. He's incredibly data focused. And so he studied all the data for a period of about 400 years when accurate data is being kept. And one of the things he studied was the legal framework in which these different families were within these different countries, and also the rules of inheritance, how inheritance was divided up when parents died. Also, what were the marriage customs, who got married to whom, and all these different things. And it's really interesting. So this is just a few points. And as I said, you know, when you study this, you can understand, oh, that's why. And so he's a remarkable person. In 1976, he wrote a book predicting the collapse of communism. And not only predicting it, anyone can say it's going to collapse, but he gave the anthropological reasons why it would collapse. He analyzed the Russian family structure, and based upon his analysis of the Russian family structure, he said communism is going to collapse. It is unsustainable because it doesn't fit with that. He also wrote another book explaining everything that's happened in America. About 20 years ago, 30 years ago, he wrote another book explaining all the things that happened in America the last few years. He anticipated all of this. He also anticipated the breakup of the European Union years ago, again, explaining because of the different family structures and everything. So I'll touch on. So I found his fascinating. I first read his book in 1985. This book here, I bought it. I read it and it changed my view of everything, to be honest. So let's have a look at some of these points he makes. So this is one family. This is called the communitarian family. This is, and in the communitarian family, there's equality between brothers defined by rules of inheritance. So that means that when parents die, the patrimony, the inheritance is divided up equally by between the brothers, between the children, usually between brothers. Daughters usually don't get so much. And so that means that within this family, equality is an incredibly important value. Yeah. The second is that married sons live together with their parents. So when married sons live together with their parents, who's in charge? The parents. And so there's a lot of, the parents then have a lot of authority because they're still around and their married sons are living together with them. And so for any wives who live together with their mother-in-law, you know, it's a really awkward experience, put it mildly. And so it's an incredibly intense relationship when you have married sons living together with the parents. It's okay for the sons because they get on with their mother. It's really difficult for the wives because it's really awkward living together with your mother-in-law. I know this from personal experience. So, you know, when we were living in Russia, we used to go home and stay with my wife's parents. And it was fine. I got on well with her parents and she got on well with her mother in the kitchen and everything was fine. Anyway, so when we moved to England, then my mother came to stay with us for 1 month, 2 months every year, 1 month at Christmas and 1 month when the tennis was on at Wimbledon. And it was really intense for my wife because from my mother's point of view, my wife could never be good enough for me, for her son. She could never keep the house tidy enough. The cooking wasn't up to her standard, etc., etc., etc. It's really difficult. Anyway, so that's the way it is when you have that kind of thing going on. And the third thing, which Emmanuel Todd analyzed and said, there's no marriage between the children of brothers. Okay, so first cousins don't get married to each other. And so he said the principal areas where you have this kind of family structure are Russia, Yugoslavia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Finland, Albania, Central Italy, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and North India. And so he said, well, all the countries that spontaneously, voluntarily went communist all have the same family structure because communism appeals to people who believe in equality. It also appeals to people who believe in authority. So you have the state is like in the position of the parent, organizing the whole of society and making sure everybody's equal. So he said, okay, that's interesting. The two prominent values here are equality and authority. And this is the values that you find within communism, and the authority of the state, but also equality. And in other words, everyone has the same salary, everybody lives in the same size house. In Mao's China, everybody wears the same clothes. There's extreme equality towards uniformity. And you can see these countries, they all voluntarily, spontaneously went communist to a large extent, or were very, there's a lot of communists in Italy, and they're all in a particular geographical region within Italy. So the communitarian family, he said, is authoritarian and equal. These are two primary values. And so the pathological expression then is communism. When it's God-centered, it's fine. The family lives happily together and it's great. But without God, it becomes godless, it becomes communism. And the other interesting thing is you have these violent revolutions. As I said, this is the problem. When you have dominating authoritarian parents, it can lead to a huge amount of resentment by these sons. And so Dostoevsky analyzes this in his book. If you've read The Brothers Karamazov, he analyzes the Russian family. And one of the things that happen is this incredible, intense relationship. And so where the fathers are overthrown, Turgenev wrote a book, Fathers and Sons, again, this intense relationship. And so where the you get this revolution, the overthrow of the fathers, by the sons. And also, we saw this in China, the Cultural Revolution. If you look at that, it's shocking how many teachers are murdered, how many professors are murdered. This overthrow of the old people. And in China, there was cannibalism. There were students who ate their professors, practiced cannibalism, this kind of intense kind of hatred for this incredibly authoritarian parents. And because they're all living together, it was an incredibly intense relationship. So that's his sort of pathological expression leads to that. Another kind of family, which I mentioned on Thursday briefly, the STEM family. Here you got the inequality of brothers laid down by inheritance rules and the transfer of an unbroken patrimony to one of the sons. So here, the rules of inheritance, often these are laws, just like in France, in Russia and Germany, there are laws about how the inheritance is divided up between the sons. I don't know a lot of detail, but anyway, there's this unbroken patrimony. In other words, the family inheritance is passed on undivided to one of the sons. As far as I know, usually the oldest son. And the oldest son then, the married heir, who is the oldest son, he lives together with his parents, and he's the one who inherits the farm, or he's the one that inherits the family business, or he's the one that inherits this. And so he lives together with the married heir, lives together with the parents. Not all the sons, like in Russia, but just the married heir lives together. And then again, there's little marriage, or little or no marriage between the children of brothers, so cousins don't get married. So what are the main values here? Inequality, and the acceptance that inequality is natural and normal. It's just the way it is, that one son inherits everything and the other sons inherit very little. So they have to find their own way. Also, one son living together with a parent. So again, you have the authority of the parent over at least one of the children. And so where do you find this kind of family? As I said, on Thursday in Germany, Austria, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, Bohemia, which I guess is the Czech Republic now, Scotland, Ireland, some regions in France, northern Spain, northern Portugal, Japan, Korea, Jews, the Romani Gypsies. So they all share the same family structure. And what do they have in common? Well, so the STEM family then is authoritarian because you have the continued authority of the parents over at least one of the children, generally over the children, and also you have this inequality. And so the pathological expression of this is acceptance of inequality, of racial inequality as well. So you get the easy acceptance of Nazism and fascism, which is an authoritarian form of government. And so also you have these people got this sort of messianic complex. Jews obviously got a messianic complex in spades. Koreans have also got this messianic complex in spades. And yeah, Germany also had this messianic complex as well, this idea of being the master race. And I don't know a lot about these other countries, but I know the Scots have a certain kind of view towards things. I don't know much about the Irish, but anyway, it's interesting. Again, it's like a pathological expression that without God, this kind of family became like this. Without God, the Russian-Chinese family became the way it became. And then you have another kind of family. This is the egalitarian nuclear family. Here you have equality of brothers laid down by inheritance rules. Again, these are by the law. You have to divide parents have to distribute their inheritance in this way. Again, there's no but this time there's no cohabitation of married children with their parents. So all the children grow up and leave home. There's no marriage between the children of brothers. And the principal regions here are northern France, northern Italy, central and southern Spain, central Portugal, Greece, Romania, Portugal, Poland, Latin America, Ethiopia. So here the main values are equality, but also non-authoritarian. And so this egalitarian nuclear family is liberal and egalitarian. So you find partly France is like this and partly France is the other way, which leads to a lot of sort of political instability. And so you can see that in Poland is like that. This attracted towards equality, which is attraction towards socialism, but is rejection of authority, which is why the reaction or rejection of communism came first of all most strongly in Poland. Then you have what's called the absolute nuclear family. And here there's no rules of inheritance. So that's the way it is. Here there's no laws governing how inheritance should be. There are no rules. And so here in these countries, people write wills. I'm going to leave my house to this person, this child, or to that child. And this is the way it is in England. You can divide your inheritance up however you want. You can give all the money to the oldest son or daughter, or everything to the youngest son or daughter, or everything to the middle one, or you can divide it up equally, or you can actually disinherit all your children and you can leave it all to a cat's home, which is what sometimes people do. And sometimes people go to court because sometimes someone gets divorced and remarries and he decides to leave all the family money to the second wife and disinherits all the children from his first wife. And of course, all the children become really unhappy about this. So lots of things like this go on. Anyway, also there's no cohabitation of married children with their parents. In other words, children grow up and they leave home. And so the parents then have very little or no authority over their adult children. And again, no marriage between the children of brothers. And so the principal regions for this are Anglo-Saxon world, which is obviously England and the United States of America, Holland and Denmark. And so the absolute nuclear family then is liberal and non-egalitarian. So equality then it's not valued very highly. So that's why socialism, communism was never really very attractive in England. And also, there's no authority of the parents over children, so there's incredible love for liberty and for freedom. So those are the values. But as I said, the pathological expression without God is this extreme individualism. Yeah, a lack of concern about equality or social justice, and also a complete rejection of authority. I just want to do my own thing. Don't tell me what to do. So the way it is in England, if you tell your adult children what to do, they say, shrug shoulders, don't tell me what to do. I'm free, I've grown up, I'm an adult. And so English parents, they don't tell their children what to do. So it's interesting. The Anglo-Saxon family is based upon the separation of parents and children in that sense. It's kind of interesting. You might wonder, why is the Anglo-Saxon family like that? Well, again, you have to go back 1,500 years to understand that. And so the Anglo-Saxons are Germanic. So why is the Anglo-Saxon family different to the traditional German family structure? Well, the reason is the people who came to England, came from Germany, the Anglo-Saxon tribes, but when they came to England as immigrants, they didn't move as families. They were just individual warriors who formed a close band of warriors together with friends, and they elected a leader, and they went and invaded England to plunder England and to rape and plunder and to settle. So they left their parents behind, and the whole basis of the relationship they had with each other was based upon a voluntary friendship, voluntary fellowship and agreement. And so that's why when they settled in England, they formed families in England, it was different to the Germanic family they left behind. So the oldest sons were left behind in Germany. They inherited the land or the farm or whatever. Younger sons, they formed a band of warriors. They invaded England. They settled in England, and they established a different kind of family, the absolute nuclear family. So the absolute nuclear family in England is about 1,500 years old. And that explains the whole of English history, this incredible love of freedom and the incredible value of the individual. And again, if you look at the English language is characterized by the letter I. If you look at I, it's just a single solitary letter, I. That's unique. If you look at in France, it's je, J-E. Whereas you look at other languages, they have in English the word, the individual is expressed by this single solitary letter I, just standing all by itself. That is an expression in the language and the alphabet of the nature of what it is to be English. You don't find that in other languages. There's usually a word made up of several letters. It's interesting. So the pathological expression then, the Anglo-Saxon family without God is extreme individualism and social breakdown. And that's what you've been seeing in the Anglo-Saxon world in the last few decades, since the 1960s. Incredible rapid rise in divorce, unmarried motherhood, extreme individualism, which of course Father criticized. Father, talked about extreme individualism being a Western thing. It's not a Western thing. It's an English thing. Yeah, Father didn't really understand, in my view, a lot of other European countries. It's just an Anglo-Saxon problem, really. Social fragmentation, disintegration, which is what we're seeing in Britain today. If we look at this in terms of, I'm just going to carry on, finish this bit off, and I'll stop. So this is how these families divided up. This is the authoritarian, the absolute nuclear family, that's here. This one here is a slightly different shade, the authoritarian family, which is this one here, which is different kind of family, Northern German, I can't remember. It's different kind. Anyway, so the absolute nuclear family is this one here and this here. I'm colorblind, so I can't tell the yellows apart from each other, and Denmark as well. The egalitarian family, which is what you find here, egalitarian nuclear family you find in Spain, you find in large parts of France, you also find in Poland, and over here, I think this is Romania, as far as I know. And also there's parts of Italy. Then you've got the authoritarian family, the STEM family, which you find here in Germany, Austria. There's a large bit of land here where lots of countries, easily went fascist. They easily became dictatorships in the 20th century. The tendency towards that. Even today, as you're looking in the 21st century, look at what's going on in Hungary and other places, the sort of rise of this kind of and desire for an authoritarian ruler. And you get the same thing here in Scotland, and this kind of Celtic kind of branch here. I guess it's a Celtic thing really as well, because the Basques are like that as well. And then you got the community family here, and there's red areas here in Russia, the Slavic kind of world over here. And they got this another kind of family over here in where cousins get married. I didn't talk about that. That's in Turkey. And so you can divide these up here. An absolute nuclear family, England, Netherlands, Denmark. The primary values here are they're liberal, liking freedom. That's why you get liberal democracy developed in particular. And not really interested in equality, so there's a lot of inequality. Very hyper-individualist, isolationist, etc., etc. Also led to early industrialization, and then you have the egalitarian nuclear family, which is liberal, trying to combine freedom and equality, which are incompatible values that were very unstable. So you have anarchy, early godlessness. This is where it comes from in France. Also very universalist. I talked about that when I was looking at the French Enlightenment. And yeah, so it oscillates then between anarchy, which is the emphasis upon liberalism, and socialism, which of course leads to authoritarianism. A very unstable kind of family. So our French government, French political system, very unstable. Then you got the STEM system, authoritarian, in lack of equality. And then you get this corporatist kind of culture, fascist, racist, wanting, and very, very hierarchical, etc. Japan, Germany, Korea, Sweden, these kind of countries. And again, well, vertically organized regime. And it works well if you're a small country because you can't invade anybody else. And the communitarian one, authoritarian, authority and equality combined together. So you get here, it's collectivist, universalist. Again, you get communism basically is universalist because of that kind of values, very conservative. And again, you get Central Italy, Russia, China, ancient Rome, and Asiatic empires, and communism as well. And so just briefly, other kinds of families. Well, this is interesting. Equality between brothers, cohabitation of married sons with their parents, and frequent marriage between children of brothers. So very often you get first and second cousins marrying. So these kind of countries, Arab world, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Azerbaijan. So these countries all became Muslim. So, and it's the same in Britain, Muslim communities, often there's marriage between first and second cousins. And of course that has all kinds of genetic problems. So the values of the family, this kind of family, fit together very much with the values of Islam. And so Islam then was easily and readily accepted in those countries. There's other kind of families here which I don't know much about, Southeast Asia as well. These, again, certain kind of political systems. Another kind of family here. So again, I don't know much about this, so southern India. I was particularly interested in how it was in Europe. So we left off at the end of the First World War on Thursday. And the reason why I looked at Korea was because the end of the First World War was the Treaty of Versailles. And so that is how Korea then entered into God's providence to make a foundation, receive the Messiah. And Father recognized and said that what happened there in Korea at that time, the 1st of May revolt against Japanese occupation, he said that was really significant because Korea connected to God's worldwide providence, establish a foundation, receive the Messiah. This desire to have a free democratic society finally emerged in Korea about 1,000 years too late, I would say, when it finally touched God's providence. But incredibly weak foundation to receive the Messiah in Korea, really, compared to what it could have been, what it should have been. If Christianity had been accepted in Korea under Nestorians instead of getting exterminated, if Catholicism been able to develop, if Protestantism been able to develop, if Korea connected to Britain and to God's Judeo-Christian, liberal, democratic, able type tradition, everything would have been so different in Korea to what it was. And Father's life, instead of being hell, he would have been able to do something with his life, far more than he's able to do, much more than he's able to do. And, you know, I read that passage out, how frustrated Father was that he wasn't able to marry into that tradition and inherit that tradition. and that inherit that foundation through marriage, how frustrated he was the way things turned out. Anyway, you dealt a certain hand of cards, you have to just deal with what you have. Just because things didn't turn out the way it's supposed to, Father said, well, this is the way things are. Where do we go from here? So even though he mentioned casually a few times about how things could have been different, he didn't dwell upon that. He said, okay, this is the way it is. Where do we go from here? Yeah, that's really a key point, Father. He just said, okay, this is the way it is. What do we do next? Anyway, so let's have a look at the Second World War then. As I said, why did it, what are the origins of that? What were the causes of the Second World War? Well, like everything, there's no single cause, a variety of causes. A lot of German resentment of the Versailles Treaty, because as I said, they expected it to be on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. But when the German delegation arrived at Versailles, they were not allowed into the room to have a conversation as equals with the Allies. Instead, they were given the conditions of the peace treaty instead of being able to agree them. So they felt like they'd been betrayed and stabbed in the back. There was an incredible feeling, which is true. Germany was not invaded in the First World War. Not a single American, British, or French soldier invaded Germany or tank. So this feeling, we didn't lose the war. Instead, we were stabbed in the back. Who? By? Well, by the civilians, and in particular by Jews. And so they had a natural desire to rebuild Germany after this. And there's also, following this, the demand for reparations, which are huge reparations that Germany was expected to pay back, especially to France. The French just wanted this sense of revenge. The French at Versailles, they wanted actually to deindustrialize Germany. And they wanted Germany almost to go back, to be deindustrialized, because France wanted to have the same position in the continent of Europe as it had before 1870, where France was the dominant power. So France then at Versailles wanted to reduce Germany, not quite to the Stone Age, but to the way that it was 100 years before, 70 years before. America didn't want that, Britain didn't want that either. So there's a lot of disunity there on the Allied side as well. Anyway, the French managed to extract huge reparations from Germany and very, very tough conditions upon Germany in the Rhine Valley, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so this, following the First World War, the demobilization of all the troops led to the Great Depression, which affected Germany really badly and America particularly badly. It didn't affect Britain as badly for various decisions that Britain took from an economic financial point of view. So as we know, this led to stagflation, huge inflation, where if you wanted to buy a loaf of bread, you had to have a wheelbarrow full of money in Germany. And this, of course, led to a collapse in wealth, collapse in people's pensions, a huge social collapse, and collapse in values, a huge amount of poverty, incredible level of unemployment, and tough. And of course, when in this kind of situation, people are looking for political leaders who can provide solutions. And so in large parts of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, this led to the rise of fascism, with charismatic leaders who gave hope and establishment of dictatorships through much of Central and Eastern Europe. So the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had these independent nations, but they didn't have any democratic tradition stretching back hundreds of years. And so it's very, very easy for them to fall prey to the attractions of having a strong leader who promised to solve all the problems, and led very easily to this kind of dictatorship. There's also, and in Germany, of course, with the instability of the Weimar Republic, which also didn't have very long and strong roots. So democracy, especially liberal democracy, didn't have strong, deep roots in the continent of Europe, other than in Holland, maybe Denmark, Switzerland. Elsewhere, there were no strong roots. And then there's a desire for expansion, for living space. This is imperialism. So one of the reasons why Britain got off so lightly is that Britain, after the agricultural industrial revolution, the British population expanded hugely. So, well, what to do with all these people? Well, many people, they just emigrated. And so Britain was able to maintain a lot of its stability because it exported lots of people. They went to settle in America and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, through the empire. So there's vast expansion there. France, something similar, not as much. Japan then wanted more living space. It expanded into China. And Germany also, growing population, didn't have an empire, much of a foreign empire. It also wanted to expand, so wanted to expand to the east to create a greater Germany. And along with that, well, obviously somebody's living to the east. These are predominantly the Slavs. And so there's a desire to move in that direction. And so, along with this came this sort of a rise of racism, particularly and Nazism, which is basically a racial ideology. You have the one race, the Aryans at the top, and then you've got all these different racial groups, and a lot of conflict there between the Teutonic people thinking they're better than the Slavic people, and almost wanting to ethnically cleanse, move east and ethnically cleanse Eastern Europe of the Slavic people living there. And also we had a rise of, intense anti-Semitism. This is, again, I've talked about that before, it's sort of historical legacy going back 2,000 years, but it became very, very intense racial anti-Semitism in Austria and Germany in particular. So could the Second World War have been prevented? Well, I mean, historians say yes. Britain and France could have challenged Germany in the mid-1930s. At that time, Germany was economically and militarily very weak. And so if Britain and France had wanted to, you might say, they could have together won a short war against Germany. But then you have to think, okay, that theoretically that was possible. Britain and Germany could have challenged the rise of Hitler and had a short war and defeated Germany and imposed, you might say, something else. But the reality is Britain and France are both democracies. You don't win an election on the promise of going to war with Germany. Britain and France are both traumatized by what happened in the First World War. They never, the Great War, the war to end all wars, the last thing they wanted was another war. There's no way you're going to win an election by promising to go and overthrow fascism and Nazism and Hitler in Germany. You're going to lose an election if you promise that. So even though theoretically it's possible for Britain and France to have challenged Germany in the mid-1930s, defeated Germany in a short war, politically it's impossible. It's just it was not a possibility. The other possibility is that Britain and France could have allied with the Soviet Union against Germany. But from the British point of view, the Soviet Union, communism was no better. It was just as evil, just as bad as fascism and Nazism. And so, the British political class said, no, we don't want to ally with the Soviet Union and communism. We're very much aware of all the evils that are going on under communism, and it's certainly no better than what's going on in Germany, fascist Germany. So as a result of that, so this is the Soviet accusation is that Britain and France should have made an agreement with the Soviet Union against Germany. But from the point of view of values, that's unthinkable for Britain to have done that. And so the Soviet Union then thought, okay, if we can't find allies with Britain, the Soviet Union, Stalin then decided to make a peace treaty with Germany, with Nazi Germany. And so there's basically a policy of appeasement. So when Japan occupied Manchuria, again, the League of Nations did nothing about that. And so dictators thought, well, okay, that Japan occupied Manchuria in 1932, the League of Nations, the international community did nothing. Maybe we can get away with it. Then Italy also wanted to have its own empire. So Italy invaded Abyssinia, it's now called Ethiopia, in 1935. Again, the League of Nations, the international community did nothing. And so dictators became emboldened and thought, well, why don't we do something? And so you had what happened in Munich in 1938. There was this agreement between British Prime Minister Chamberlain and Hitler, Munich Agreement. And this allowed Germany to go and invade a certain part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, I think it says. Anyway, the reality is that when Hitler did that, he invaded that area where a lot of Germans were living in Czechoslovakia. And Hitler said, well, you know, they are all Germans. They should be part of Germany. Yeah. And there was a lot of guilt on the part of Britain towards Germany having been mistreated at Versailles. And so, okay, let's take the easy way out. Instead of challenging Germany, let's allow Germany. They've got a good case. It sounds plausible, sounds reasonable, sounds legitimate that they should occupy that part of the Czech Republic. And so Germany did. The Czech Republic at that point was incredibly strong. It had an incredibly well-developed armaments industry. The Czechs, they invented the machine gun. They had a very strong armaments industry, producing tanks and airplanes and everything else. And they could have easily defended themselves against Germany. But Britain basically sold out Czech Republic and persuaded the Czechs to allow Germany to occupy that particular area. Hitler went on to occupy the whole of Czechoslovakia. But at the same time, because Germany then captured the Czech armaments industry, this enabled Germany to build up its army, its military, on the basis of the military armaments industry in Czechoslovakia. So what is fascism then? Hitler's a fascist. Mussolini was a fascist. And so this is what fascism is. It's National Socialism. People say fascism and socialism have got nothing in common, but the clue is in the name. It's a national form of socialism. But like all forms of socialism, you have the state control of the economy and society. That's what you have with National Socialism, as well as international socialism or communism, or any form of socialism. You've got the state control of the economy and society. And this is just from the principle says this, it's the abolition of democracy. So you don't have democratic elections anymore. There's the abolition of the free press. So all the newspapers and the media are taken over by the state and used as instruments of propaganda. There's no longer any freedom of speech. If you say the wrong thing, you get arrested. There's no longer freedom of association. You're not allowed to meet up freely. There's the abolition of individual rights. All these things go along with fascism or National Socialism. Then, okay, the personal will of the leader determines policy and ideology. So it's dictatorship. So it's Hitler or Mussolini or whichever leader happens to be the one who formulates all the policies and establishes what the policies and ideology is going to be, and everybody has to go along with that. Along with this, you have the cult of the personality, Heil Hitler, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You have pictures of Hitler or pictures of the dictator all over the place, of the leader all over the place, and people worship the leader. Race and nationality, the highest values, that's the sort of the Nazi dimension of fascism, where you get, you know, certain racial groups which are highest, and then other ones which are lowest. And it's, you know, if you're the right nationality, the right race, you're okay. And so for Hitler, he thought that England, Britain, would be a natural ally. Because he said, well, you know, this is part of his approach, he thought in racial terms. He thought England, they're Germanic people, the Anglo-Saxons, they were also tall, blonde, blue-eyed, they should be the natural allies of Germany. That's his expectation. But of course, you know, that's his misreading, you might say, of politics. So he was very shocked then when England went to war against Germany, shocked out of his mind. Here under fascism, individuals exist for the sake of the state. So again, I mentioned this before, the principal view is the individual, the purpose of the individual, the purpose of the state, and the purpose of the whole should guarantee the purpose of the individual. That's the principal view, that the individual fulfills its individual purpose through the purpose of the whole, and the purpose of the whole is there to guarantee and protect the purpose of the individual and enable the individual purpose to, to be fulfilled. Fascism is the purpose of the whole, the purpose of the individual is sacrificed for the purpose of the whole. That's fascism. The individual exists for the sake of the state. Yeah, that's fascism. So the fascism and communism and statism generally, the state owns it. The state owns the individuals and has a legitimate right to sacrifice them for its own purposes. That's contrary, completely against the principle as written in the Divine Principle book. Again, all power and authority is invested in the supreme leader, etc. I'm sure you've read about Hitler. So here's the first one. This is Mussolini. He was the ruler of Italy about 20 years. He said, I send greetings to my followers. I am Il Duce, your great leader. I'm like a god. I have done so much for the Italian people. So this cult of personality is like a sort of, these people regard as like God, like the emperor was God, the Roman emperor was God, and all these kind of pagan figures were regarded as being God. So he saw himself as like a god. There's Adolf Hitler, ruler of Germany, again for about 12 years. He said, I'm the greatest leader of all time. I have great plans. Soon there'll be a special German church where the Bible is replaced by my book called Mein Kampf. The cross will be replaced by the sword. So it's important to understand this. Fascism, Nazism wasn't just a political phenomenon, it was a cultural phenomenon, it was a religious phenomenon, yeah? About trying to expunge the Bible, the biblical tradition from Germany, yeah? Jesus was a Jew. So as much as Hitler hated the Jews, he also didn't like Christianity either. And so within the German church, there's a movement to try to present Jesus as not being a Jew. So this is one of the reasons why the Gospel of Mark was proclaimed by the German biblical scholars as being the first and the earliest gospel, because it's the one which Jesus is the least Jewish presentation of Jesus. So this movement within German biblical studies to present Jesus as a Galilean, not as being a Jew. So it's very interesting how this whole thing affected everything. All of academia was affected by this ideology. And you got the Martin Luther Church in Berlin. So they wanted to take these churches and replace the iconography. And this is like the stained glass window. Instead of having saints, you'd have a German stormtrooper. If you look here, this is the lectern where sermons would be given. And what are the carvings on the outside? They're not saints. They're German stormtroopers. There's Jesus surrounded by German stormtroopers. So it's trying to reconfigure Christianity as in a different kind of framework, represent different values, trying to subvert and co-opt Germany in that way. It's the same sort of thing going on here. Yeah, going to get this sort of, instead of saints, you got that. So this church is still there. It's a historical monument or artifact. And you can see, again, different kind of symbols going on here. And of course, you got the swastika, different kind of cross. So how did the Christian church respond to this? So shamefully, the Catholic Church formed very, very strong links with Nazi Germany, with Nazi party. So a treaty was made between Nazi Germany and the Vatican, signed by the future Pope Pius XII, 1933. There he is. Which Nazi Germany agreed to various things with the Vatican and guaranteed various things. So here you've got Catholic priests supporting a Nazi youth rally. These are all Catholic priests giving the Heil Hitler salute. And so this is an incredibly shameful period in Christian history in Europe, to be honest. This is at Nuremberg, the vast, incredible rallies, propaganda and all sorts of things. I went there and I stood there, where Hitler gave his speeches. I stood there and I gave a speech, but people didn't respond the same way they responded to Hitler, and I was really disappointed. But, So other causes of the Second World War. So from the principal point of view, restore the three great blessings on the growth stage. So you have a false Adam. This is Hitler, an antitype of Jesus Christ. And multiplication, second blessing, you have the ideology of racial purity, the master race. Those of you who live in Scandinavia know that German young men were sent to Sweden and other countries to have sex with blonde-haired, blue-eyed Swedish girls and to produce the master race, and incredible trauma left behind by that. Vision of world conquest. Also, yeah, for other countries, the Christian countries, the challenge was to overcome the second temptation of Jesus' second temptation. The temptation was not to oppose Hitler and Nazism. In Britain, there's a very strong temptation. Lots of parts of British political society, they did not want to go to war with Germany again. You know, the first World War was devastating. Let's try and make peace with Hitler. Let's try not to oppose Hitler. So it's really important to overcome that. And also it's about the restoration of God's sovereignty. Through the Second World War, the defeat of Nazi Germany led to the expansion of freedom and democracy within Europe, and which of course is the foundation to receive the Messiah. Let's see who's on whose side. Abel's side is America, Great Britain and its empire, and France. The Cain side is Germany, Japan, and Italy. And why? Well, Britain, America, France, they were democratic, Christian, there's religious freedom, Abel type view of life. Germany is anti-democratic, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, neo-pagan, Cain type view of life. Japan is also militaristic, imperialistic, with forced Shinto worship in Korea and elsewhere. And Italy is also fascist dictatorship as well. So that's why it divided those two different ways. So how did the Second World War start? Well, a lot of historians now, they trace it actually to 1931. Japan invaded China. Second Sino-Japanese War, which Japan won, defeated China. Then there's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when, as I said, Germany and the Soviet Union entered into a non-aggression pact. Molotov was the foreign minister of Soviet Union, Stalin. Ribbentrop was the foreign minister of Germany. And they divided Poland up between them, just like Poland had been divided up earlier between Prussia, Russia, and Austria. This time they connived to divide Poland up between Germany and the Soviet Union. Then they agreed to divide Northern and Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres. So then, of course, the Northern, that's why the Soviet Union went and marched into Finland. And then later on, after the war started, there was a second round of talks between German-Soviet Axis talks. And there was a discussion there between Germany and the Soviet Union of the Soviet Union joining together with the Axis powers, joining together with Germany. And then they discussed dividing the British Empire between them. So this is, of course, something the Soviet Union, inheriting this Russian kind of thing, was to have India, British India. Germany didn't go along with this because right from the very beginning, Germany wanted to go east. Didn't really want to go west, it really wanted to go east. So this is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That's Molotov there, that's Stalin. I can't remember where it was signed. And then this is Ribbentrop welcoming Molotov in Berlin in November 1940. And again, with the possibility there of trying to make an agreement, which, as I said, didn't happen because Hitler already was planning to invade the Soviet Union. Then on that basis, Germany was able to invade Poland and Soviet Union invaded Poland at the same time, shortly afterwards, and occupied the other half of Poland. Then France, Britain, and the Commonwealth declared war on Germany. That was a huge shock for Germany. just like it's a huge shock for the Kaiser that Britain went to war over Belgium. So Britain had guaranteed Poland's borders. So did that. The Soviet Union then invaded the other half of Poland a few days later, and then it attacked Finland. That's part of the agreement with Hitler. And then Germany invaded France, because Germany felt free to invade France to move west because the back door was protected. Yeah, that was always the risk for Germany, to fight a war on two fronts. So feeling confident that the Soviet Union was not going to invade, it invaded France and other countries in 1940. Same sort of plan as they did in the First World War. Then Italy declared war on Britain and France. And then France surrendered just after a few weeks. The French Communist Party, under the direction from Stalin, sabotaged the French army. The French Communist Party supported the invasion of France by Germany. And then what happened next was a long story, but to cut a long story short, the Axis powers then, having occupied France, having not been able to cross the Channel and occupy Britain, because Germany lost the Battle of Britain, couldn't gain dominance over the airspace and invade Britain. So because Germany couldn't invade Britain, then it turned its eyes east to where it originally wanted to go, having defeated France and occupied France. Then the Axis powers then invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. This is a huge shock for Stalin. He could not believe it. And so the Soviet army was completely unprepared. Stalin had executed most of the best generals in the Soviet Union. He was totally traumatized by what happened. He went and hid in his dacha until some of people came along and said, what should we do? And finally they decided to do something. And then Japan attacked America, 1941. And then Japan then conquered Southeast Asia, Singapore, threatening Australia. Then there was the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. This was the final solution, where the Nazi leaders, under Hitler's direction, they met together and they planned the extermination of the Jews, the genocide, the Shoah, the Holocaust was planned in 1942. So this is when Germany then had invaded Poland. And of course, when they invaded Poland, they found a lot of Jews living in Poland. What are you going to do with them? It also invaded the Soviet Union. A lot of Jews living in the Soviet Union. What to do with them? And so they decided we're going to exterminate them. And so this is the point where Germany was the most powerful and its strongest. Britain had been pushed back and lost, basically. And for me, this is kind of significant that just after this, in Britain, what's called the Council of Christians and Jews was established. So all the Christian leaders, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, the head of the Methodist Church, the head of the Church of Scotland, the head of all the churches in England, together with the chief rabbi and other rabbis in England, they formed a Council of Christians and Jews. And the patron of the Council of Christians and Jews was the king. And so this meant that Christians in Britain, Christian leaders said, we're not going to allow the same thing to happen to the Jews in Britain as has happened to Jews on the continent of Europe. The great shame in European Christianity is not a single church on the continent of Europe spoke out against the Holocaust. Not a single church on the continent of Europe spoke out against that. There are many good Christians who hid Jews, but not a single institutional church condemned what was going on to the Jews on the continent of Europe. Only in Britain did the institutional churches speak out against what was going on. And they knew that by speaking out against it, they knew, these Christian leaders in Britain knew that if the war was lost, they knew they would be the first people to be put to death and to be killed. So Christians then, the second Israel stood up in support and defense of the first Israel in Britain, 1942. And then I think this is significant spiritually, the unity of the first and second Israels. And it's only after that, that at the lowest point for Britain, the point where it felt like it might be defeated, you had this unity of Jews and Christians. And then the war started to turn. Germany then was defeated in North Africa under Montgomery, defeated Rommel in North Africa. And then on that basis, it's possible to invade Italy. And then a couple of years later, there was D-Day in France, the invasion of France. And then there was a Soviet offensive against Germany. Germany that invaded the Soviet Union. A terrible siege of St. Petersburg. Unspeakable what went on there, the number of people who died, and the suffering that went on there in St. Petersburg, well, in Stalingrad, as it's called then, also in Moscow. In Leningrad, as it was called then. St. Petersburg used to be called Leningrad. The unspeakable suffering that went on, the Russian people there, also in the siege of Moscow, and then also the terrible battle in Stalingrad, where eventually, Germany was defeated there in the Soviet Union. And far more people died in the Soviet Union. Soviet soldiers died than Allied soldiers from Britain or France or Germany or America. So the Soviet offensive then was decisive. Soviet offensive against Germany. Then Germany surrendered, 7th of May. Then Japan surrendered a couple of months later. And then Korea then was occupied by the Soviet Union. And the North was occupied by the Soviet Union. And the South was occupied by the United States of America. Okay, so thought I'd finish there. If it's okay with you, I'm going to stop. And if it's okay with you, would you like to carry on again on Tuesday, tomorrow? I'd really like to finish this series. So if it's okay with you, I'll carry on tomorrow at the same time.